Good evening. I am Michelle Covington, and I serve as the Vice President of Advancement at ICCF Community Homes, and we are celebrating 50 years of serving people in this community and working in the housing justice space. And we thought, what better way to celebrate this milestone and to look towards the future than to have an evening with Miss Leah Rothstein. So I'm going to introduce her tonight and tell you a little bit about her, and then she will come to the stage. Leah Rothstein is the co-author of Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, that describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. She also writes a regular column to which you can subscribe for free at justaction.substack.com. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots of the halls to the halls of government. She led research on reforming community correction policy and practice to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer and labor organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Leah Rothstein.
All right, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here to celebrate 50 years of this amazing work. I got to hear more details about everything that ICCF is doing right before this, and I'm just so inspired and impressed. So let me just, here we go. So I am going to be talking about racial segregation, the segregation of our communities. And just to give a little roadmap of where I'm going to go tonight, I am going to start by talking a bit about the history, how we came to be a racially segregated country. I think it's important before we move into how we get out of a situation to understand how we got here. So I will cover some of that history and then start to talk about solutions and ways we can begin to challenge segregation in our communities. Much of the things I could be talking about are already happening here, so I'm going to try to expand on what is already in place here in Grand Rapids with ICCF Community Homes and try to inspire some new ideas as well. So first, I want to talk about this idea of de facto segregation. It's the explanation we've adopted as a country to explain why we are racially segregated. Every metropolitan area in all regions of the country is segregated by race, particularly the segregation of whites and African Americans live in separate communities in metropolitan areas in the South, North, Northeast, and the West, and the Midwest, all over the country. And we tell ourselves as a nation that the reason for this segregation is it's a de facto form of segregation, not caused by laws or policies, but caused maybe by private actors, bigoted landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers, who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white communities. Or it was a result of private or personal preferences. We like to live around people who look like us, and so we self-sort into same race neighborhoods. And we look around, many of us look around and think it's too bad, we're so separated, but there's not much we can do about it because something that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We have not only no obligation to do anything about it when we understand that it happened with these mysterious forces, but we have no agency to affect change around it. So this de facto segregation idea is very prevalent. The Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because, he says, the federal government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in challenging it. So very pervasive belief in this country. So in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, he decided to take on this de facto segregation idea. He wrote a book called The Color of Law. I'm curious if folks here are familiar with that book or have read it. So some, yeah, great. So as you know, that book basically debunked the de facto segregation idea. And what he argued with detailed examples from all across the country from decades of history is that sure, there were private actors who were at play in creating and sustaining racial segregation, but their actions, they were incentivized and often explicitly required by government, all levels of government, local, state, federal government, explicitly requiring that as we built communities, we built them on segregated basis, and that we sustained that racial segregation over time. And what he went on to say in The Color of Law is that those policies, those government actions, they were in violation of the Constitution. They were a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments, much like the laws that segregated the South, that segregated lunch counters and buses and schools in the South, that we eventually, as a country, decided was unconstitutional and changed those laws. But the same policies segregated our neighborhoods and were as much a violation of the Constitution as those laws in the South. And as such, when we reckon with that history, and this was the call to action in The Color of Law, is that when we understand that our government broke the law in creating segregation, we understand that we have an obligation to do something to remedy it. When our government violates its own laws, we as a country, as citizens, as residents, have an obligation to fix those violations, not only reverse the laws that were in violation of the Constitution, but remedy the ongoing harms that those laws caused. Well, my dad sort of thought that was the end of the conversation. If we understand this obligation, we'll all do something about it. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But, we haven't really lived up to this obligation to remedy segregation yet. And I'll give one example from history of a very powerful policy on the part of the federal government that created segregated communities. It's one of the more powerful, but there are many, filled up the entire book of The Color of Law, of examples of these kinds of policies. So this one started around the mid-20th century after World War II, when millions of war veterans came home from the war and they started families. We had the baby boom, and they were met with a housing shortage. There wasn't a lot of housing being built during the war, nor prior to that in the Great Depression. So these growing families and communities didn't have enough housing, much like, we might find similarities to today. So the federal government wanted to step in and do something about that to meet this demand for housing. And it did so by helping to subsidize the building of suburbs all over the country. So at the time, we weren't a suburban country. Most people lived in urban areas. That's where the jobs were. They're mostly manufacturing jobs. People lived near where they worked because we didn't have the transportation systems we have today. And those, urban areas were fairly racially integrated because manufacturing facilities employed different races, and people had to live near there. So those urban areas were fairly racially integrated. But when, this huge demand for housing happened, the federal government decided it wanted to help build suburbs and move white families out of the inner cities, out of urban cores, into suburban communities. And it did so by helping to subsidize developers who wanted to build these suburbs. Now, one famous example is Levittown, outside of New York City, on Long Island. It was built by a developer named William Levitt. He wanted to build 17,000 homes in what was a rural area. Not many people lived there, but there were a lot of people in New York needing housing, and he thought he could start a community of 17,000 homes for all of these families that needed housing. Now, he couldn't finance 17,000 homes out of his own pocket. It's a lot of money. It was even back then. And he couldn't get a bank loan to do it because, it seemed very speculative. Nobody lived out there. Who was going to buy these 17,000 homes? So the only way he could finance building Levittown was through a federally backed mortgage, a federally backed loan guarantee from the federal government through the Federal Housing Administration that would provide this subsidy to William Levitt. And this is just an example, did the same thing with developers of suburbs and subdivisions all over the country. The federal government said, look, we'll give you this subsidy if you promise to only sell your homes to whites. And not only the first time, but to go even further and put what's called a restrictive covenant on the deeds of those homes. These are restrictive covenants. They say the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. written into the deeds the permanent record of that property. Now, William Levitt, he was, not to sort of put a, not to make him sound too good, he was a bigot in his own right. He said at the time that he wouldn't have sold his homes to African Americans if he was given the choice, if he was left to his own devices. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. If we could imagine an alternate history where the federal government lived up to its constitutional obligation to not discriminate and said, look, Levitt, we'll give you this subsidy if you promise to sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, Levittown and the entire country would look very different than it does today. So Levittown today is 2% African American in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. Now we might think, how come this still exists? We have, 60 years of fair housing laws on the books. You can't discriminate anymore in the sale and rental of housing. Those restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but they have long-lasting consequences and impacts. And here's how that works. So those homes in Levittown and suburbs like it, all over the country, they were affordable when they were first sold. When they were first built, they were subsidized on the building end. Homeowners were subsidized through the FHA or Veterans Administration mortgages, white homeowners. So they were affordable to working class families who had a job in the post-war economy of any race could have afforded these homes. The homes in Levittown, when they were first sold, cost in today's money about $100,000. Now for that area, that's a very affordable price for a home. Homes in Levittown and suburbs like it all over the country no longer are affordable or within reach for many working class families. The median home price in Levittown is today over $600,000. And in many suburbs and subdivisions that were built this way, several $100,000, some places over $1 million. So the families who were subsidized to get into home ownership when it was affordable, what happened? They built wealth. Their homes appreciated in value. They could sell that home or refinance it, take money out of it. They could use that wealth to send their kids to college, to enjoy their own retirements, or most importantly, hand down that wealth to their children and grandchildren to help them buy their own homes. African Americans explicitly prohibited from participating in home ownership when it was affordable and building wealth in the same way. So that's why, even though the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 and said we can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing, it didn't do anything to address the disparities that existed based on decades of that history and wealth building for whites when African Americans were explicitly prohibited from building wealth the same way. So we today have a wealth gap that hasn't diminished and has only gotten larger since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So we have an income gap between blacks and whites in this country that is concerning, and the subject of another talk, another book, I hope, where average African American household income is about 60% of average white household income. Now, you would think that the wealth gap would be about the same. Two families that make about the same amount of money could save about the same amount of money and build up the same wealth. But average African American household wealth is 5% of average white household wealth. And that huge disparity goes back, a direct link to these policies in place in the 40s and 50s and before that helped whites to build wealth through home ownership and left African Americans on purpose explicitly out of that experience. And that's why we have these ongoing, consequences of segregation, even though the laws that created segregation may have been changed since then, but the consequences are long-lasting. They're still with us. So the wealth gap is one of those consequences. The segregation of our neighborhoods also underlies many of our most serious social problems and racial disparities and polarization of our country. The segregation, the neighborhood you live in, you may have heard the saying, it goes something like, your zip code matters. Where you were born, the neighborhood you grew up in, has a huge impact on your life outcomes. So one of the ways that works is segregated African American communities have been zoned to be closer to industrial land uses, for example, or closer to highways and freeways. So children in those communities, they grow up breathing more polluted air from all the trucks driving by and the factories spewing pollution in the air. The soil is more likely to be contaminated, the soil, where they play. Their homes are older and more likely to have lead paint, so the children are more likely to suffer from lead poisoning. Those children more likely to have asthma, far higher rates of asthma in those communities than in white communities. When you're up all night wheezing because of asthma, it's harder to do well in school the next day if you haven't had a good night's sleep. So all of these reasons, they compound to where we are today, where children who grow up in segregated African American neighborhoods have lower incomes when they grow up, they have less educational attainment, they have health issues that white children who grow up in white communities don't have at the same rates. So African American children who grow up in these segregated areas, they grow up to have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and lower life expectancies, drastically lower in some places, than nearby children who grew up in nearby white communities. So we not only have an obligation, I would argue, a constitutional obligation, to remedy the harms caused by government policy that created separate segregated communities, but we have a moral obligation to address these issues that really impact the quality of our lives, how long we can live, and sort of the opportunity available to all children and adults in this country. So how do we do that? I'll get to that in a minute, but I'll say first that, a lot of people read The Color of Law, and it has had a huge impact, kind of a surprising impact on the conversation about these issues in this country. And the de facto segregation idea has a little less juice, a little less currency today. We more clearly understand, you hear redlining, that term, just that term, you hear that a lot more than you did 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. So we're reckoning with this history and the policies that created segregation. And more clearly starting to see that we should do something about it. But it doesn't mean we know what to do. And so a lot of people who read The Color of Law, they heard the call to action that my dad wrote into that book, that we have this obligation to do something, but then they came up to him after hearing him speak or reading his book and said, well, what do we do? How do we live up to that obligation? It's not obvious. It feels like segregation is an overwhelming issue to try to address. It feels very entrenched. It feels like just the way this country looks, and there's no way we can ever get out of it. Well, I asked him that question too after I read The Color of Law. I said, well, I have a background in housing policy and community organizing, and I didn't see how we could easily get out of this. So he asked me in return, well, why don't you help me figure it out? So that's how we came to write Just Action together. And it's attempting to answer the question of what do we do now? Now that we're here, we recognize the history of how we got here, how do we start to challenge the segregation of our communities? And I have to say that I started by asking him this question because I didn't see what we could do. I wasn't that hopeful that we would find a lot of solutions. But after researching the book and speaking about it all over the country, I have come out of this project extremely hopeful and so full of ideas and inspiration of what can be done and examples from around the country of communities in all kinds of states and all kinds of regions that are actually working on these issues and making big advances in their communities. So what we argue in Just Action is that to live up to this obligation, we need a newly activated, re-energized civil rights movement that is taking on segregation head-on. So the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s made great advances in racial equality in a lot of areas, left residential segregation virtually untouched, partly because it's hard to affect change on. And so we argue that we need to now turn the attention, re-energize this movement, and turn the attention on residential segregation. We might think after 2020, we had a racial reckoning in this country. 20 million people came out in Black Lives Matter demonstrations after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. 20 million people of all races, ethnicities, income ranges, suburban communities, urban communities. There's more people and more diversity of people marching for racial justice than ever in our country's history. But, not a lot has changed since then. A lot of people went to those marches and then went home and maybe put lawn signs on their front lawns, or maybe they started book clubs to learn about this history. All really important things, steps to take to raise awareness. But then there needs to be action after those steps. We raise our awareness, we understand how we got here, And then we have to do something to actually affect change. It doesn't just happen on its own. So we can build off of the energy of that movement to do this. And what we argue is to affect this kind of change, we should start by focusing on the local level. So even though the federal government was a main driver in creating segregated communities, once segregation is established, to a large extent, it's maintained and sustained by local policies. So there's a lot that we can do locally that will be very effective methods to challenge segregation. And, we live in a very polarized country politically on the federal level. So if we start by looking to what we can do federally, nationally, we'll be stuck there for a long time. And instead, we can start where we can actually affect change, which is locally in our own communities, through our own city councils and planning commission meetings, and other ways of getting involved locally that can really have an impact towards challenging and undoing segregation. And then once we build that in communities around the country, we will together build a national movement that can eventually support national policy change and investments. So to start building this movement locally, we argue that we need to start by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups, coalitions in our own communities that can start to work on these issues together. Now, we understand that that first step is in itself might seem daunting. And we live in very segregated communities, so a lot of people, most people in this country, don't have many social relationships with people with other races outside of the workplace. Because, when you live in a community where everybody looks like you, when you go to the grocery store, you drop your kids off at school, you go to the park, you see people who look like you, and that's who you tend to have social connections with. And so, but in order to actually build an effective movement, these groups need to have participation of whites, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, all of the people represented in that community with shared leadership. And to do that, we need to build social connections and trust amongst each other. Part of one of the worst effects, I think, of segregation in this country is that we don't relate to each other because we live in such different communities. We tend to then take that as proof that we are different, fundamentally different humans, and we're not. So we give some examples in Just Action of communities that have taken some intentional steps to bring people together from segregated parts of the same city, people of different races, to start to build social connections and build relationships that they could then use to together advocate for change locally. They're great stories. If we have time in the Q&A, I can tell you about some of them. They're in the first chapter of the book if you want to read about it. But one is Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where there were 6 Presbyterian churches, 3 on the white side of town and 3 on the African American side of town. There was some racial unrest in the city, and the pastors wanted to do something about it, so they started an interracial dialogue group. Had to have equal representation of blacks and whites in this group. So when one person wanted to leave, they had to be replaced by someone of the same race. They met regularly. They would meet individually outside of the group, and they started to get to know each other, break down some of the barriers that divide us. Then this group went on to advocate for change in their community. They got African American history adopted in the curriculum of their local schools. They got a police civilian review board adopted for their police department. And then they went on to build some Habitat for Humanity homes together. So it's an example to show that may be daunting, but not impossible to do. So then once these groups are formed, what can they do? Well, we describe dozens of policies and strategies and programs that local groups can focus on in their own communities that go a long way towards challenging segregation. And what we say is towards redressing segregation. When I say redress, I mean 2 things. One is looking to the future to ensure we're changing the policies that maintain segregation from here forward. We don't want anything, we want to change the policies that maintain segregation, looking to the future. And we also need to look to the past. Unlike what the Fair Housing Act did, we need to address the disparities that exist because of past government policies. Even if those past policies have since been changed, those disparities are still with us, and so we need to address those today. So the policies, the strategies we talk about collectively do both of those things. And then we group the strategies into 2 major categories. The first are strategies concerned with increasing investments and resources in lower income segregated African American communities, where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of government-sponsored segregation, because I think we all probably understand that the segregation that was created through government policy wasn't a benign separation of people. It wasn't just some people live here and some people live here and all else is equal. Those same policies ensured that communities where whites were subsidized to live, helped to live in, were areas of what we call high opportunity neighborhoods. They had access to well-resourced public schools and well-funded public resources, libraries, parks, clean air, open space, access to jobs and transportation. And the neighborhoods where African Americans were limited to living in were denied many of those same resources. So to remedy the harms of that, we want to increase the resources in those lower income segregated neighborhoods. Now, we also understand that when that happens, when resources increase in a lower income area, oftentimes what happens is suddenly people with higher incomes become interested in living there. We call this gentrification. They move into the area, they drive up the housing costs in that neighborhood, and the longtime residents of that neighborhood are priced out of their own neighborhood just when it's starting to see an increase in investment. So we want to prevent some of the displacement that can occur when investment increases. So we have anti-displacement strategies as well that should be coupled with these increased investment strategies. So some ways to do that are protecting renters against unjust evictions, for example. Oftentimes in gentrifying communities, lower income tenants are forced out of their homes, evicted for not good reasons, so that those landlords can get higher paying tenants in. So a local government can adopt a just cause eviction ordinance that says that tenants can only be evicted for just cause, and the ordinances usually name what those are: failure to pay rent, violation of the lease agreement, for example. And other than that, they can't be evicted. It helps protect renters in these gentrifying areas from being displaced from their neighborhood. Another policy is inclusionary zoning. This is, again, a locally adopted ordinance that requires that when new market rate housing is built, a certain percentage of the units built have to be sold or rented at affordable prices. So that ensures that as a community is gentrifying and developing, that some of the new units built are affordable to the longtime residents of that community. Another is a right to counsel program, which I'll get into in a minute. But first, I want to describe one really effective model for increasing homeownership opportunities in gentrifying areas and preventing some displacement there, which is the community land trust model. And I know ICCF has its own land trust, so some of you might be familiar with the land trust model. It's a great model for doing two very difficult things, which is creating permanently affordable homeownership opportunities and preventing displacement that can occur in areas where housing costs are rising rapidly. There's over 300 communities around the country with the land trust, and they are growing a lot right now, especially in this housing affordability crisis that the whole country now finds itself in. The land trust model is a great way of addressing the housing need today. And how it works is a land trust acquires land. Sometimes it's donations from local governments, sometimes they get funding to buy land or homes and fix up or build homes on that land, and then sell those homes at affordable prices to lower or moderate income homebuyers, families. And it can sell those homes at affordable prices because in the transaction, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. The land trust is a nonprofit organization, so it owns that land sort of as a community asset. And then the home is sold without the land attached to it, which makes the home cost lower because rising costs of land are one of the primary drivers of rising costs of housing. So if you take the land out of the equation, the house is more affordable. And then the homeowners, they own that home like any other homeowner, and when they want to resell the home, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes. And every land trust kind of establishes it in a different way, but they all usually try to balance the goal of allowing the home selling family to earn some equity in their experience. It's a limited equity arrangement, so they don't build up as much wealth as if it was sold for market rate, because in turn, the home is sold at an affordable price for the next home buying family. This is virtually the only way to have a permanently affordable home ownership program without continuing to put massive amounts of subsidies in at every resale, which most communities don't have those kinds of resources to do that. So it's a great way to get lower and moderate income families into home ownership who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to do so. So oftentimes I give this example and I say, what you can do is start a land trust, but hey, there's already one here. So there's a lot you can do to support the community. It's the Community Homes Land Trust, right? Community Homes Land Trust with ICCF that, we can support land trusts in our communities by helping ensure that they can continue to grow their portfolios of homes. And we can do this personally by, donating time, resources to a land trust, or what we could do that's more effective is what we can do collectively together, and that is advocate that local governments and institutions donate unused, vacant, maybe foreclosed homes or unused public land to a land trust to build these permanently affordable homes on them. We have examples from around the country of communities that have done that, and there is sort of endless examples of local governments in all kinds of communities sitting on vacant land, unused vacant homes or unused public land that the local government owns, and they could, donate some of that land to a land trust to help expand its portfolio and have more affordable homes. Additionally, so I talked about those restrictive covenants before. So those, are from the mid-20th century, no longer legally enforceable, but they're part of the permanent property, the permanent record of that property. They're on the deed of the home forever, even though they no longer can do anything. So in some communities, and we researched some of this around the country, those deeds also name the companies that were involved with building and selling the home when it was first sold on a restrictive, discriminatory basis. That's the developer, the builder, the bank that financed it, the realtor that first sold it. So those companies, now we did some research on this in Charlottesville, Virginia. Those 4 companies that were listed on these deeds with restrictive covenants they're all still in business in Charlottesville, or they've been acquired by other businesses that are still operating in Charlottesville today. Many of them put statements on their website in 2020, denouncing racial inequality and promising to do better in their communities. So a local group organized around these issues could find those institutions and corporations that exist that had a hand in creating segregation and help them understand that they have an obligation in combating the segregation that they helped to create. And one way they could do that is by donating to a land trust, for example. So that's another idea of what we could do. I mentioned right to counsel programs. So right to counsel programs, again, locally created programs, usually funded by local government through legal aid societies or other legal services agencies. They provide a free right to an attorney to low-income tenants who are facing an eviction. So most of the time, when a tenant, particularly a low-income tenant, is served an eviction notice, they are told to come to court and defend themselves. But most of the time they don't, because they don't have access to legal representation. They don't know how to defend themselves. They don't think they have much recourse. And they often don't, because landlords show up with attorneys. They've done this a million times. They know how to push this through the courts, and the courts usually just rubber stamp every eviction order that comes through, unless those tenants have legal representation. So we wrote about Cleveland's Right to Counsel program. They were one of the first cities to adopt this kind of program. Several others have since adopted them. And in Cleveland, it's the United Way that partners with the Legal Aid Society. The United Way gets notice of all of the tenants who are served eviction ordinances, and they follow up with them and let them know that they have a right to an attorney. And they have had huge success in all of the clients that they represent. I think it's like 80 or 90% of them have avoided being evicted from their homes, from their units. The lawyers have been able to find them the funding that they're eligible for to help them pay rent that they might have missed, and help them avoid having an eviction order on their permanent rental record, which is hugely important for renters to have a clean record in order to be able to rent in the future. So again, this is a locally adopted program funded by local governments that can go a long way towards helping renters, particularly right now as housing costs are rising and renters are at risk of being evicted and losing their access to their homes because landlords see an opportunity to be able to charge more. So that's the category of strategies that are concerned with preventing displacement and increasing investments in lower income communities. Equally important are strategies that are concerned with opening up exclusive, usually more expensive, predominantly white, often suburban communities to more diverse residents. So we have to be doing both of these things simultaneously to really redress segregation. Some of the ways to do this include starting with changing the zoning in these areas. In suburban communities, virtually all of the land in these areas, the residential land, is zoned only for single-family homes, which means they can only have one home per lot. And that means as demand increases for homes in that community, the number of homes can't increase to meet the demand. The price can only rise. So it ensures that those homes remain white and affluent because the homes are out of reach for everyone else. And in fact, single-family only zoning came to prominence when racialized zoning was found to be unconstitutional. So it has its origins in racial segregation motivations. Single-family only zoning was adopted in white communities to keep those communities white. So if we want to diversify and open up access to those communities, we should start by changing the zoning to allow more than one home per lot, which allows a wider range of housing sizes, housing affordability options, and provides access to a wider range of residents of those communities. Another example of a strategy to open up these more expensive communities to diverse residents has to do with Section 8, or the Housing Choice Voucher Program. We've all probably heard of this program. It's the largest rental subsidy program funded by the federal government for low-income tenants to be able to rent units in the private market. It's what's called a mobile benefit. So Section 8 recipients, they get a voucher that they can use to rent anywhere in the jurisdiction of their housing authority. Now, the Section 8 program, when it was designed and adopted, had the promise and the potential to provide the opportunity to lower income tenants who wanted to leave high poverty neighborhoods to be able to move into high opportunity neighborhoods because the voucher was mobile. It wasn't tied to a public housing unit, but it hasn't lived up to its potential. Only 5% of Section 8 tenants can use their voucher to move to high opportunity neighborhoods. And white Section 8 tenants are far more likely to be able to use their voucher in these neighborhoods than African Americans are. There's several reasons for this. Even though the Section 8 program is a federal program, there's a lot of discretion and a lot of work that can be done on the local level to make it a better opportunity, a better tool for mobility for low-income tenants. One has to do with discrimination. So discrimination against tenants who use Section 8 to pay their rent is allowed by the federal government. It's not a protected class federally, which means that according to the federal government, a landlord can say, a landlord can say, you use Section 8, I won't rent to you, just flat out. Even though it's a public benefit, you would think that the government would protect those it's giving benefits to from discrimination for using that benefit, but they don't yet. But there are 20 states and 100 cities and counties, including Grand Rapids, who have what are called source of income discrimination ordinances. And that means that here, it is illegal to discriminate against a tenant just because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. But as we know, with a lot of anti-discrimination laws, passing the law is only the first step. We have to then ensure that people know about it and that there's enforcement and ways of monitoring if it's being adhered to. Now, the only way we can really know where discrimination is happening is through what's called paired testing programs. Has anybody heard of paired testing? A couple people? Yeah. So it's usually fair housing organizations or civil rights organizations that run paired testing programs. And what they do is they get volunteers, or sometimes they pay people to do this, to pose as potential tenants for units that are listed as for rent. And if you're testing for Section 8 discrimination, some of those testers will say they use Section 8 and some will say they don't. Otherwise, they're very similar characteristics of tenants. And if the one who says they use Section 8 is told, I'm sorry, the unit's already been rented, and the other tester is told, oh, you can come see it tomorrow, well, that is clearly that's clearly where discrimination is occurring. And that's kind of the only way to really know where it's happening, unless a landlord, which this also happens, puts on the ads for their units that they just don't accept Section 8, which here in Grand Rapids would be illegal. But lacking that evidence, this testing program is the only way to really know where discrimination is happening. These fair housing centers, they need volunteers to be testers. They need funding to be able to do this kind of work. So this is another thing we can do, just individually. Tomorrow, you could go on to the website of the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. I saw on their website, you can sign up right there. They have a training in February, and you can sign up to be a tester. In testing for discrimination for rental units, it's usually just phone calls to landlords who have units listed as for rent, and they train you how to do it, and it's one way we can contribute to counteracting the discrimination that might be occurring in our communities. So in the interest of time, I will give one more example, even though I could talk for hours about many more examples of what we could do. We also, so I talked about examples of strategies for lower income segregated African American communities to increase resources and prevent displacement, and strategies for opening up exclusive white communities to more diverse residents. And then we also have strategies for increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in all neighborhoods, wherever they would like to buy a home. There's a lot of strategies for doing this. This is one step towards narrowing the racial wealth gap, is increasing home ownership amongst African Americans. We can do that through down payment assistance programs, and we argue for race-based down payment assistance programs that benefit African Americans as a remedy for the policies that led us to the situation we have today, where whites buying homes are far more likely to have family gifts to be able to afford down payments than African Americans are. So to remedy the legacy of those past government policies, we can provide down payment assistance targeted specifically at those who are harmed by those policies. We can also provide homeownership counseling, education, and we can also address the many obstacles that African Americans face in accessing home ownership that whites don't face in the same way. So one of those examples is the credit scoring system. So the credit scoring system, we're all probably familiar with credit scores. They're very important pieces of our financial story, right? We think of it as an objective system. It's an algorithm. It must be true because it's based on some hidden math that we can't know about. But it takes in your financial history and gives you a score based on, how well you've paid debts in the past to tell a bank if they think that you're a good candidate for paying a debt in the future. So if you have a high enough credit score, you're more likely you'll be eligible for a mortgage, and if it's really high, you might even get reductions in the interest rate because they think you're a great borrower. So that makes some sense. If you've defaulted on loans in the past, maybe you're more likely to default in the future, so that makes some kind of sense. But it's not as objective as we think because of what information goes into the credit scoring system. So it does factor in your financial history, but it's only a certain type of financial history. It's what's called traditional financial instruments. So bank loans, car loans, credit cards, mortgages. If you have that kind of financial history, you'll have a credit score. And if you've been, a good borrower for those kinds of financial instruments, you'll have a good credit score. But if you haven't had access to those traditional financial instruments, you won't have a credit score at all. It doesn't mean you're invisible financially. It's just you don't have the kind of financial history that feeds into a credit score. So segregated African American communities, as a result of decades of financial redlining that still exists today, have fewer physical bank branches. Black communities of all income levels have fewer bank branches than similar white communities. So if you don't have a bank branch in your community, you can't go into the bank and ask for a loan or get a credit card through your local bank. You might use what's more accessible in your community, which might be, say, a payday lender. Those do exist en masse in segregated African American communities. Now, you could borrow money from a payday lender, have exorbitant interest rates, pay it on time in full. That information doesn't get factored into a credit score because it's considered non-traditional. Now, I would argue that if you could pay back a payday lender, that's a pretty good indication that you're a responsible borrower, but it's just not how the system is designed. Similarly, if you've owned a home in the past, you've had a mortgage, you have mortgage history that can feed into the credit scoring system, you get benefit of that for paying your mortgage on time. But if you're a first-time home buyer and you've been a renter your whole life, maybe 30 years, 15 years of being a renter and never missing a rent payment, that financial history is not factored into a credit score. Now, I would also argue that's a pretty good indication of how well you do at paying your debts, especially because rents tend to rise every year, unlike mortgages. So if you're keeping up with your rent payments, you should get some benefit in your credit score for that. But how the national systems work is they don't across the board factor in rental payment history. Some of them are starting to. They have programs where you can opt in to that, but it's a slow process. It's been I think 15 or more years of them talking about starting to factor in rental payment history, and now they're just starting. So while we wait for that to be fixed on the national level, we can work with our local banks and financial institutions and credit unions to start factoring in rental payment history for their own mortgage applicants locally. And we write about some banks and financial institutions that have done that. It goes a long way towards opening up mortgage access, credit access for African Americans. So another example of what we can do locally, working with our local institutions to adjust slightly how they do business, because how they've done business up until now has had a racially discriminatory impact. And so we have, an obligation to address that and fix it. And this is one way we can do that. So I know I just dumped a lot of information on you, and it might feel overwhelming, but that's partly on purpose. So I'm sorry if it's overwhelming, but I hope that even if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that you remember that there's so much that I said, because there's so much that can be done. So this excuse that we don't know how to address this, I hope is no longer valid, because there are so many ideas of what we can do locally to address segregation. They're all, little pieces that go into maintaining the status quo that we can change, and little by little, we will start to undo it. So with that, I will stop now, and Ryan will come up, and we're going to have some time for questions. Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Ryan Wise, and I'm privileged serving as the CEO at ICCF. And I'm a self-proclaimed fanboy of the Rothstein family. And so I'm pretty excited to be up here. Thank you, Leah, for coming today. Thank you for your important work, really having us reckon with that broken history. I was telling my son that I got to do this. I was talking with him on the phone. He's like, haven't you had that book on your shelf for like forever? I was like, well, 7 years isn't forever to me, but to him, it's like half of his life. So, but it's been really formative for not only me as a professional, but our community, and so thank you for your work. So we have the opportunity to have a bit of extended conversation here with questions from the audience. So what we're going to do is, if you have a question, feel free to just stand up where you are if you're able, and just shout that question out. Parameter here, make sure it's a question and not a second lecture. We had a really good lecture. We want to have a good question and answer time here. So who wants to start us off with a question? Who's the brave soul who wants to start?
No, I didn't explain everything that well.
Well, I'll ask a question maybe to get it started then. Sure. So every so often I get a chance to be a part of one of the social work classes here at Calvin University. And one of the times I was speaking, I had a student ask, how do I make sure that when I go to live someplace, rent a house or buy a home, I'm not part of gentrification? What do you say to someone who recognizes and has reckoned with some of that brokenness and doesn't want to be a part of perpetuating it through where they live?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, first of all, that we can't completely stop gentrification. To completely stop it, it would mean stopping investing in these lower income communities. It would mean limiting the ability of homeowners in those communities to sell their homes for high prices. Now that they're worth something, you want to tell them that they can't sell it for as much as it's worth and make, build up that wealth like they were hoping to. So given that we can't completely stop gentrification, and we maybe don't want to, we do want to mitigate its impacts. And, some of the ways we could do that are policies to prevent displacement. And another way is how we show up in those communities. So we write about this in Just Action, and we reprinted with permission from a person that has lived in a lot of gentrifying communities around the country. He's currently in Brooklyn, I believe, and he wrote a pamphlet on how to be a conscientious gentrifier, and he handed it out to his neighbors. And, they're fairly simple ideas, but put all together, it is very striking in just thinking about how you show up when you move into a community that's undergoing gentrification, where people might feel threatened by your existence or your presence in their neighborhood because it means that their community is changing and they might be at risk of being priced out of it. So ways to do that is to show up and be part of that community. I think there were 9 steps on his list. I won't remember all of them right now, but they include learning about the community, learning about the institutions and buildings that are important, learning what's changed since, in the last few years, since you've gotten there or right before you got there, what people in the community who've lived there for a long time are concerned about, why they might be upset about gentrification, what they've lost. Patronize the local businesses, the mom and pop shops that are probably struggling when gentrification happens. Often, more chain stores come in, or business owners with more access to resources displace the long-time small mom and pop shops there. So patronize those shops that have been there for a long time. Go to the churches and congregations and synagogues and other religious institutions, become, part of those communities. Basically, they all involve just being a good neighbor, talking to the people who walk by you on the street, being open and welcoming, and sending your kids to the local public schools. So being fully integrated in the neighborhood can mitigate some of the harmful impacts of gentrification, which aren't just about housing prices, but about the culture changing in that neighborhood that oftentimes people are just as upset about. So become part of that culture instead of sort of coming in and displacing it and replacing it with your own.
Thanks. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm sure they did have to deal with it. And I don't know that we wrote about how they dealt with it in that particular example, but we do have another example in the book from Chicago, Evanston, a similar, it wasn't through churches, but it was another interracial group that formed, and they took a pilgrimage to Montgomery to go to Bryan Stevenson's museums and learn about the history together. And they were worried about, because it was initially a white group that was going to do this together to learn about the history, and some of their African American neighbors wanted to be a part of it. And the white people who started this group were worried. They didn't want to have to, they were worried about their unconscious biases coming out in learning this history together alongside African Americans. And so they talk to each other. How can we address this? How can we make sure this actually builds relationships rather than breaks them down? So their friends, their neighbors, suggested that the white people in this group read White Fragility before they went on the trip. So all of the whites in this group got the book and they read it. And, it's an ongoing, it's not something that ever just goes away like that. But I think the process of building up trust between the people, that the people involved were willing to look at this issue, and instead of just going blindly into this trip together, to face some really hard truths about our country, that they were willing to kind of do some internal work as well. And we write about this, that a lot of it's a circular thing, right? Implicit bias and the structures we live in feed off of each other. So where do you start to undo that? It could be by working on your own internal implicit bias, or it could be by changing the structures. And when the conditions change, we learn different lessons about each other. You know, we tend to be less biased when there's less disparities in our country, for example. So it's a balance, and we are very careful in this book because we're very focused on action, that we can't get stuck in the internal looking at our own biases. And, you know, we have to accept that we all have them, and that can't stop us from working towards change. We have to then take all of what is included in our complicated human experiences and work towards making things better, and that then our biases will, you know, eventually be reduced collectively, societally. But it has to be a balance. We can't just stay looking internally and expect conditions to change. We have to then translate that to action. Great question. Thank you.
Which is like in some ways a good protective thing, right? Like long-time homeowners in a gentrifying neighborhood might have their home values increase really rapidly, but they don't see the impact of that on their property taxes, which can be good. But on the flip side, you also have like lots of long-time homeowners who have kind of benefited from a very long tenure, right? And, we have a really high racial disparity in homeownership rates in Kent County. I think 36% black homeownership rate and a 76% white homeownership rate. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on like how policies around land taxation and how that might help or hurt segregation or redress segregation.
Yeah, great question. So I live in California, where we have Proposition 13 that was passed a long time ago, that your property taxes are based on the value of your home when you bought it. So people, more likely whites, who owned homes in the 70s when prices were very low, pay very low property taxes. And it has damaged our entire state because we can't collect enough revenue through property taxes to fund schools and to fund public services. So there's certainly a balance to be struck where we need to be able to collect the property taxes, or we need to reform the whole system where our public services aren't completely reliant on property taxes. There could be other ways of funding them. But it is, I think that there could be, thinking off the top of my head, because I didn't know that about Michigan before, about the property taxes. There could be like occasional kind of reassessment across the board where values are trued up more closely to the current value. And with additional policies that provide property tax deferments or grants to help lower income homeowners cover those increase in property taxes. Because again, it's a balance of collecting the revenue that the local governments need and ensuring that people are, contributing to those revenues fairly, like truly based on the value of their home, and also not having that be a cause for people to lose their homes through unpaid property taxes. So there does have to be a balance, especially in gentrifying communities. But, another issue is, and I assume that this is happening in Michigan, they cap how much your assessed value can rise, right? Is that what you said? Yeah. By inflation? Yeah, so then what happens is in white communities, property values are rising way faster than that cap than in African American communities. So white homeowners are underpaying in property taxes relative to African American or other homeowners in communities of color. even keeping the values of their homes constant, right? And this is true all over the country. Counties all over the country have this property tax disparity not because the assessed values are capped, but because they don't do accurate or very frequent reassessments. So they virtually cap them. They do a county-wide adjustment every year. But the adjustments aren't, the home values don't rise the same way at the same rate across a whole county. Some neighborhoods, they rise faster. And if that's not reflected in your assessed value for your property taxes, you're either overpaying or underpaying. And so we address this in the book because we say that even though, increasing home ownership for African Americans is essential for reducing the racial wealth gap, just getting into home ownership isn't enough. We have to address the disparities that exist once you're into home ownership. And one of those disparities that's not very talked about or well known is the disparities in property taxes, which exists all over the country and is a locally controlled issue. Not here, because there's caps on the state level, but county tax assessors have a role to play in this as well. So there's areas that have commissioned studies to try to figure out how they can fix the assessment system to get rid of these disparities. Because if white homeowners are underpaying in their property taxes, someone else is overpaying. Property taxes have to be, they have to raise a certain amount of money. If someone's not paying enough, someone else is making up for it. And if you're overpaying in your property taxes, it's harder to hold on to your home. It's harder to maintain it to the level you want. It's harder to build wealth through that homeowner experience because more of your money is going to pay property taxes. So it's an important issue, for sure. I'll have to think more about the cap. But thank you for telling me that.
Well, it's hard to believe, but our time is
wow.
up. So thank you for those questions. I want to share a few words of gratitude. First of all, Leah, thank you so much for coming to be with us this evening. If we could give Leah another round of applause for her.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for an action orientation. We often can sometimes get into this paralysis of analysis, and I appreciate the fact that you're calling us to take steps of intentional change. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you to our friends here at Calvin University for hosting this evening. This is a great venue for this kind of conversation. And thank you to all of you for coming out on a weeknight to learn more about housing and the reckoning that we have to do with our past and hearing ideas about how we can make positive change in our community. So thank you for being a part of that change. One of the ways you can continue to be a part of that change, boy, they're trying to, time was up. I said thanks. If you didn't get a chance to grab a book, I know we have some copies of the book in the lobby complimentary for you. If it's kind of first come, first serve. So I don't know, don't fight over it. But if you haven't had a chance to get a copy of that, please pick that up and read it. There's some really great content in it. I know I left after reading it feeling really encouraged about the good work that not only we're a part of at ICCF, but our partners in the community. There are several partners I see in the room today. We've been blessed with some really great housing work, housing justice workers in this community, and so really grateful to that. So thank you all for coming this evening. Have a great night.
Thank you so much. Oh, really? Let me off. Thank you. Yeah. This was good. Good crowd. Yeah. Right.